Welcome to this month's episode of Evidence of Greatness. For this month, I'm going to review a new paper that just came out. It was just recently published, and it's called Research on Solution-Focused Approach in 2022, a Scoping Review. And you might be wondering why I'm reviewing a 2022 article. It's actually an article that was published in 2023 that looked back on the 2022 research. And the reason for that is because oftentimes it takes a bit of time for us to collate all of the research in a particular year. And so oftentimes we have to go back in time in order to look at the current state of research. So I imagine that research like this will be more forthcoming as we move along. But this gives a really good snapshot of what kind of research is happening in solution-focused therapy and what the outcomes are. What impact does it have on our understanding? I should be really clear that this research was conducted by the European Brief Therapy Association's research group, and they took a bunch of time to complete this scoping review. So it's really a worthwhile project. The literature review that they talked about, again, talks about that up until relatively recently, Alistair MacDonald was keeping a list of all of the research, and the European Brief Therapy Association has kind of kept up that effort. And so this adds kind of to an understanding of what the European Brief Therapy Association is finding about what the research says. Also, it adds to the evidence base, the evidence-based status of solution-focused therapy. And this is the first scoping review that looks at a specific time frame, just the articles that were published in 2022. So although there have been other meta-analyses done, there have been other, systemic reviews and those kinds of things, this is the first one that is specific to a given calendar year. So they sought to find some answers to some questions, and these are the questions that they were particularly looking at. In what contexts does the solution-focused research, and when they say SFP, that means solution-focused practice, so that's broader than just solution-focused therapy. So in what context does solution-focused practice research, was it conducted in? What country did it come from? What were the samples that they used? What settings were they done in? What journals were they published in? So they just want to kind of capture a snapshot of what's happening with the research. The second question that they're looking for was, how was the research mainly performed? So what was the methodology? What instruments did they use? Did they use control groups? Those kinds of things. And those questions will tell us, in essence, the quality of the research. So with that question, they're looking at how good was the research that was conducted in 2022 about solution-focused practice? The third question is, what were the main intervention characteristics? And then the last question is, what were the main outcomes or interesting findings? So I'll try to walk through each of those questions and kind of talk about what they found. As far as the methods go, how did they collate this? They did a systematic search in several different databases where articles are generally cataloged. They found 71 total studies that were published in 2022, which is quite a few, given the trajectory that we've been on before. Of those 71 studies, 58 of them were research articles. So about 80% of the total papers published were research articles. An additional 6 of those were reviews, 2 systemic reviews, 1 meta-analysis, 2 theoretical reviews, and 1 was a different scoping review. 6 were theoretical or descriptive papers, so they wouldn't be considered in the research article category, and 1 was an instrument validation study. So then we take just the 58 research articles and we look at those and we say 47 of the 58 were outcome studies. 8 were process outcome studies. So in essence, what was happening and did it impact the outcome? And then 3 were process studies. So what happens in solution-focused interactions? and what impact and what are we seeing about what's happening during that process. So we're going to consider 58 studies that were conducted about solution-focused brief therapy. So then they broke down the results to answer in corresponding to those 4 questions that they asked. So the first one is the publication criteria, or the publication characteristics. Almost 80% of the studies were published in English. 7 of the studies were published in Persian, 4 in Indonesian, and 1 in Malay. So you can kind of see the Middle East and Southeast Asia are kind of hotspots, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. And then also studies that are published in English. They were published in a wide variety of journals, but they were specifically looking at things like the impact factor and the ranking system, those kinds of things. And the reason why they're looking at those is because we want to know, are the studies being published in high quality places? Are they being cataloged in Google? H5 is a Google number, and it tells us a little bit about like the quality of the study. 47% of the studies that were conducted in solution-focused practice were not listed in any of those. And so what that means is that we really need to increase where our studies are being published and increase the rigor with which we strive to do the research so that we can get it cataloged in these places. There were 28% of these that were listed on all 3 of these systems, which means those are really high quality studies. So that just kind of gives an indication of we have room for improvement as far as the quality of research. Next, they were looking at where the studies were conducted. The 58 studies came from 15 different countries. 37 of those studies, or 63%, were from Asia, mainly from the Middle East and Southeast Asia, which, going back to the languages that they were published in, Persian, Malay, Indonesian, you can see that there. 12 of the studies, or 20%, were from the US. And then it kind of drops off from there. And they'll come back and talk a little bit about that. But only 5 studies conducted in Europe, 3 in Africa, and only 1 in South America. And so one of the things that kind of talks about is, despite the fact that solution-focused practice is kind of expanding across the globe, we really need to do more research in the various continents to say, is it effective in these places that it's being taken? And so, again, we have some good news here, but we also have some room for improvement here. Then they took all of the participants in total from all of the studies, and they said, where are these studies being conducted? Interestingly, the biggest bulk come from educational settings, followed by medical or healthcare settings or outpatient settings, followed by counseling settings. And so despite the fact that solution-focused brief therapy originated as a therapy approach, very little of the research currently is being done on therapy. And instead, and this is one of the rationale for calling it solution-focused practice, is that it's being done in medical settings or in healthcare settings or in educational settings. And so it's being applied more broadly than just in therapy. One of the things that's interesting is that about 67 or 2/3 of the study participants were adults, and and only 24% were adolescents. So again, we know a lot about what's happening with adults. But also, one of the interesting things is that most of the studies, half at least, only conducted the research with female samples. And so we're getting a big understanding of how females respond and what the outcomes are with females, but we have much less information about males. In addition to that, and this is again a place where we could develop some understanding and where we could bulk up the rigor of our research, is that a lot of the studies didn't report things like ethnicity of the participants or education level of the participants or their status. And therefore, the researchers in this scoping review, they couldn't evaluate that. So again, when we think about the applicability of solution-focused brief therapy with samples worldwide, we need more information about the demographics of people who are getting solution-focused practice. so that we can understand how applicable it is beyond just adult females. So that's something, again, another kind of growth area for solution-focused research. When we look at design and methodology, 3/4 almost of the studies were quantitative studies, which in research arenas, quantitative studies kind of are valued a bit higher than qualitative studies or mixed method studies. And you can see that reflective here. Now, at the end of the article, the authors kind of say, we as solution-focused practitioners may need more qualitative, we may need more mixed method studies to see, does it work with people that we're working with? Not solution-focused isn't an approach that should just be broadly applicable. And we should say, well, since it works across the board, it should work with you as an individual. And so we need to keep that in mind as we look at the research and as we look at quantitative studies, and with the goal of kind of mass application. In addition to that, 26 of the studies were quasi-experimental or experimental, and 14 were randomized controlled trials. Randomized controlled trials are kind of looked at as the gold standard of research, so there's a little bit of room for improvement here. Although quasi-experimental and experimental studies are good, they look at solution-focused practice compared to something else, some control group. Oftentimes the control group, and we'll come back to this a little bit, is treatment as usual, or it's no treatment, or it's on a waiting list. And there's lots of research already that shows that any therapy is better than no therapy. And so although these studies kind of contribute to the knowledge that we have about solution focus, again, there's room where we could increase the rigor of the studies that we're doing. In addition, the authors kind of mentioned that most of the studies looked at problem-focused outcomes like decreasing depression or decreasing anxiety or decreasing problematic interactions within family members or something like that. Whereas very few were focused on positive outcomes or solution-focused outcomes. And so one of the things that they talked about is in designing our studies, we probably need to change our research questions and look at the development or the adaptation of positive traits or coping mechanisms or strategies rather than just problem reduction. Interestingly, almost half of the studies from 2022 showed that solution-focused brief therapy was delivered in a group format. That one of the things that the authors kind of talk about is that's probably not very realistic as far as how solution-focused practice is disseminated typically, where it would be more in an individual process or a couples or a family process. And so it's interesting because we know a lot about group work in solution-focused brief therapy, but we know less about individual and couples formats. Then they looked at kind of what we would call intervention modality and fidelity. 34 or just about 60% of the studies showed that solution-focused brief therapy was evaluated purely as an intervention of its own. Although it's not really clear oftentimes what that means or how closely they stayed to a treatment manual or what the protocol was. So again, there's a question about fidelity that comes in there, but a 30% or a third combined solution-focused practice with treatment as usual. Most often, this was psychoeducation or CBT. And again, it's very hard to parse out then the fidelity of these kinds of studies. What impact does it have when we combine something with some other kind of treatment? So again, there's some room here for improvement. And then they looked also at the number of sessions given, and I think it's important to know that the average number of sessions was 6.37 sessions per study. And we might then be tempted to say, well, solution-focused brief therapy is effective in 6 sessions. And although we might be able to say a bit of that, we need to be careful because oftentimes the number of sessions is limited on purpose within research studies. So people going in may know, oh, we only have 6 sessions or we only have 8 sessions, and therefore process might be impacted by that, knowing that the end is coming rather than just kind of having an open end. But it is important to know 6.37 was the average number of sessions. But the range ranged from 1 session all the way up to 29 sessions in the various studies. So still relatively low number of sessions, and especially when we get to how useful were the outcomes, this is not very many sessions for some really positive outcomes that we see as a result of these studies. Now, some of the main findings, and I think this is important, really significantly, the findings were consistently positive across all studies. So all 58 studies showed there was a positive trend in the direction of solution-focused practice being effective. It was statistically significant positive change in 61% of the studies on all of the measures that they were looking at. So in essence, they were saying, if we're looking at depression and anxiety and stress and whatever, it was solution-focused brief therapy was effective statistically with all of those. Whereas only 7% of the studies, only 3 of them said it was effective with some of the measured outcomes, but not all of them. Between group differences, so when they're comparing solution focus to some other modality of treatment, 38, there were 40 studies total that made this comparison between solution focused and non-solution focused treatment. 38 of the 40 studies reported favorable outcomes for solution-focused practice when comparing it to no treatment, waiting list, placebo, or the treatment as usual. So by and large, they're saying solution-focused brief therapy has positive outcomes. 11 additional studies showed that solution-focused practice produced similar outcomes to other known approaches. So things like CBT and mindfulness and those kinds of things. It's saying it was equally effective. Only 3 studies showed that the other form of treatment was more favorable. And those 3 types of treatment were mindfulness, behavioral couples therapy, and compassion-focused therapy. And I'm not exactly sure what kind of behavioral therapy or what kind of compassion-focused therapy, but those are just general categories. And 1 study found favorable outcomes over the other approach, which was the spiritual intervention and client-centric therapy. So by and large, what does all of that mean? It means that 49 of the studies showed, 49 of the total sample showed really favorable, statistically positive outcomes, and at least on par with their other counterparts. Included were 11 studies that focused on the client's experience. So there was a bulk of studies that were outcome studies. Now we're going to change over and look at process research and to say, this is what happens during the process that might make a difference. So there were 11 studies that kind of fell into this process-oriented research. And again, all 11 showed positive themes that were associated with the solution-focused process and showed that it was useful and beneficial for clients. Particularly, clients in these studies mentioned the best hopes and exploring what works were particularly helpful, whereas the miracle question wasn't that helpful, or it caused some difficulty for some people. And so I think that's an interesting thing. Sometimes we hang our hat, and oftentimes when evaluating is something solution focused, we say, well, it has to include the miracle question. And I think the research here is saying it doesn't actually have to include the miracle question in order for clients to find it useful. And so I think that we as clinicians can really take something from this and say we can do solution-focused work without necessarily asking the miracle question. In addition, the use of solution-focused questions as compared to problem-focused questions was associated with the improvement on measure outcomes. So focusing on problem-focused questions did not help outcomes particularly. In addition to these 11 studies, there was 1 microanalysis study that looked at presuppositions from the solution-focused practice across time. And there was 1 study that reviewed solution-building skill development. So those are the 13 studies that looked at process research in 2022. Then they concluded with a discussion, and some of these things we've touched base on before, but I'll just reiterate, is that One, we should be trying to publish research in higher ranking journals, and we should try to get these articles connected to the various indexes that show the quality of the research. This will help us to kind of make an argument that the research is good, sound research, and that it's well-respected research. In addition, they talk about how more research is needed in Africa, Europe, and South America. And again, this would help us have a global understanding of, is solution focused effective across the world? Are there adaptations or changes, especially in the process, that need to happen in the different areas of the world? Also, we need to be really aware that solution focused practice is spreading outside of the therapy world. Again, most notably in education, medical settings, which means that we need to potentially expand our language to be more inclusive, rather than just solution-focused therapy, really talking about solution-focused practice. As we mentioned before, when we're doing research, we really need to be clear about the demographics of the sample, and we need to be intentional about studying different groups of people and expanding beyond just adult females. The focus on problem reduction is consistent with a lot of research. However, we could do really, really good, innovative work by focusing on skill development or on things related to people's desired outcomes, instead of just looking at problem depletion. Then they also talk about how solution-focused practice was shown to be effective across all studies. And this means that it is effective with a wide variety of presenting problems. It is useful with a wide variety of people. So we can't lose that. In all of the times, I think I've said several times, we have some areas of improvement. We absolutely do in the research world. But we also want to say all of the studies showed that it was effective across whichever domain they were looking at. And then finally, there were issues with measuring fidelity, and there's something that could be done about this, is to create some fidelity measures to measure fidelity as we do our research. And this would increase the validity of our studies. And then here is the final reference, so that if you're looking for this article, you'll know where to find it. So I hope that is helpful to you. Hopefully that gives you a snapshot. We're really making some incredible strides in the research around solution-focused brief therapy. We're really seeing that it can be effective across so many applications. We're seeing that it can be effective outside of just the therapy room. But we can also do some things to increase the rigor of our research, to increase the validity of our research, and to increase the credibility of our research. So for those of you who are interested in doing some research, take some time to make sure that your study is really well designed. Take some time to make sure that you're giving us information about the demographics of the people participating. Give us some real clear indication of when it's effective and when it isn't. That will help us to continue to make the argument the solution-focused is an evidence-based approach, which we've made that argument many times, but it will continue to be important for us to do that. And it will also be important for us to say that solution-focused brief therapy is as effective as other evidence-based approaches. And so we're really making some incredible strides. And there is a lot of research that shows that solution-focused brief therapy can be really, really effective. So hopefully that was helpful to you. And if you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll do my best to address those. Thanks.